What would you do if, long before language, long before memory as we know it, you suddenly felt that something unseen was standing right beside you in the dark of an ancient savannah night? This question is unsettling for us today, but for primitive humans living 2.7 million years ago, it was the beginning of something far greater than fear. It was the spark of an inner world awakening. Imagine a mind still raw, shaped almost entirely by survival, now confronting sensations it could not touch or name. A rustle in the grass, the glow of distant lightning, the stillness after a predator's cry. Each of these moments carried a weight far beyond their physical presence, stirring a hidden instinct to search for meaning in what could not be seen. As those early humans stood before nature's vastness, something remarkable began to happen inside them. Their brains were evolving, expanding not only in size, but in complexity. And with that complexity came an unexpected consequence: the ability to imagine. The ability to feel that the world around them had layers they could not fully grasp. They began to sense patterns, rhythms, and invisible forces shaping everything they experienced. Not because they were trying to explain the universe, but because their minds could no longer ignore the depth of their own perception. This subtle awakening was not a sudden revelation. It was a slow, pulsing recognition that the world was more than hunger, cold, and danger. There were moments that felt charged, as if the air itself carried intention. A dying ember glowing in the night, a shadow moving without wind, the warm body of a companion fading into stillness. These experiences planted seeds in their consciousness, silent at first, then growing into questions they could not articulate but could deeply feel. And this is where the first traces of spirituality began to rise, not as organized belief, but as an instinctive response to the mysterious. It was not about gods or rituals. It was about surviving in a world that seemed to whisper back. You have probably felt something similar at least once in your life, even if you could not explain it. You already know how powerful that sensation can be. You may have even wondered if someone else has felt the same. Before we follow how this invisible presence shaped their thinking even further, I want to know your side of this. Have you ever sensed something you could not logically describe? Your experience matters here. Leave a comment, sharing what moment in your life made you question the invisible. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, because what you will discover next might shift the way you understand our ancient origins. Let us move forward, allowing this feeling to guide us into the next layer of their awakening as the story continues to unfold. As those early sensations of the invisible continued to echo through their waking hours, something deeper began to shift inside the primitive human mind. Awareness was no longer limited to what the eyes could catch or what instinct could warn against. A new type of perception was emerging, a silent ability to connect events across time, to recognize that certain things happen not just once, but repeatedly, carrying meaning beyond their immediate impact. This was the dawn of pattern recognition not tied to danger alone, but to curiosity, anticipation, and a growing sense that the world operated through rhythms that were larger than them. Imagine a small group watching the sky turn red before storms, noticing that some stars returned to the same place night after night, or that certain animals behaved differently when the air changed. These observations were not mere reactions. They were the earliest steps toward understanding that existence had structure. And in that structure, there was something profound. The mind, which had once processed only what was necessary to survive, was now exploring connections that stretched into the unknown. This cognitive expansion created a new kind of tension inside them. They could sense that patterns held power, yet they had no words to define that power. When lightning struck the same region twice, or when certain sounds echoed before dawn, they began to feel that these events were not random. Patterns suggested intention, intention suggested presence, and presence suggested something greater than the visible world. Each repeated phenomenon carved a deeper path into their awareness. They started to anticipate changes in the environment, but they also started to wonder, even without language, whether these repeating forces were communicating something. It was not a conscious question, not the way we ask questions today, but a subtle pressure inside the mind. An urge to pay attention, to assign meaning, to imagine that the invisible had form. This early pattern recognition also strengthened the bonds within their small groups. When one individual reacted to a familiar sound or a shifting shadow, others responded the same way. Their shared reactions created a collective understanding, a communal sense that something unseen influenced their lives. And through this collective perception, the invisible began to feel real, almost tangible, even though it could not be touched. The more their minds evolved, the more these patterns became threads connecting the physical world to something far beyond it. A rustling forest could feel alive. A repeated wind direction might feel like guidance. A sudden silence could feel like a warning delivered by an unseen force. This was not superstition. This was the birth of deeper cognition, a quiet awakening that would reshape the inner landscape of humanity for generations beyond counting, allowing the invisible to take its first recognizable shape inside the human mind. As these emerging patterns settled into the growing minds of early humans, another layer of perception began to take shape, one that was far more visceral. The world was no longer just a sequence of repeating events. It felt charged with presence. The rustling leaves were not simply leaves. The sudden silence of animals was not merely quiet. There were moments in which a primitive human standing alone might feel an unmistakable sensation crawling up the spine, a pressure in the air suggesting that something unseen was observing them. This sense did not come from logic, but from the deep emotional core that had been evolving for millions of years. Fear was the first emotion to sharpen this awareness. Fear had kept their ancestors alive long before they had the capacity for abstract thought. But now, fear was transforming into something more complex. It was no longer just the reaction to a predator hiding in the tall grass. It was the unsettling feeling that danger could come from forces that were not physical at all. A shadow that moved strangely, the wind carrying unfamiliar tones, or the sudden absence of sound created an impression that the environment itself was watching, evaluating, perhaps even deciding. Yet fear was only half of this awakening. Alongside it came admiration, a quiet awe that emerged when the natural world displayed its overwhelming power. Lightning piercing the night sky, enormous storms rolling across the plains, or the shimmering glow of the moon illuminating a landscape that once felt threatening now inspired a sense of wonder. They could not explain these phenomena, but they could feel their significance. Something beyond them was at work, shaping the world in ways they could not grasp. This admiration softened the raw edges of fear and invited curiosity, forming the emotional foundation for what would eventually become spirituality. These two emotions, fear and admiration, intertwined inside their developing consciousness, creating a psychological tension that pulled them closer to the invisible. When they felt watched, they reacted with caution. When they felt awe, they reacted with quiet reverence. These reactions began to influence how they moved, how they interpreted their surroundings, and how they interacted with one another. The invisible had become a presence that shaped behavior, even though no one could describe it. Within small groups, these emotional experiences were often shared through simple gestures or instinctive reactions. A sudden stillness from one individual would ripple through the group, causing everyone to pause, listen, and try to understand what the environment was signaling. Over time, this shared sensitivity transformed the unknown into a silent companion, an unseen force that existed between them and the world they inhabited. It guided their attention, shaped their instincts, and prepared their minds to give meaning to energies they could feel but could not yet define, opening the way for the next stage of their inner awakening. As fear and admiration continued shaping the inner landscape of early humans, their minds began searching for anchors in the physical world. Something inside them wanted to connect the invisible presence they felt with objects they could touch and see. A glowing ember left from a fading fire, a stone that seemed to vibrate with warmth, or a tree that moved differently from the others in the wind could suddenly gain significance far beyond its natural form. These objects were no longer passive parts of the environment. They became carriers of meaning, silent symbols of forces that lived behind the veil of the visible. A sound echoing across a valley might be interpreted as a sign, not just an accident of nature. A strange pattern of light reflecting on water could stir an instinctive belief that something was communicating through it. Without language, the interpretation happened entirely through emotion and intuition. A primitive human might pick up a stone that seemed unusual, holding it tightly as if it carried protection. Another might stare at a flickering flame with a mixture of fear and fascination, convinced that the fire held a presence with intentions of its own. These were not yet rituals, but the earliest sparks of symbolic thinking. As these experiences repeated, the objects themselves began to gain a kind of power in their minds. A carved piece of wood that looked slightly like an eye, a feather found in a moment of danger, or a bone that produced a deep sound when struck, became tokens of the invisible forces around them. Their meaning was not defined, but deeply felt, and this feeling spread across the group. When one individual treated an object with caution or reverence, others followed. The object became more than material, it became a bridge to something hidden. The same happened with sounds. Some tones felt protective, others threatening. When branches cracked in a particular rhythm, or when wind passed through certain openings in rocks, creating unexpected harmonics, early humans reacted as though these sounds carried intention. They began to associate them with unseen beings, attributing personality to the environment itself. Light also played a central role. The shimmer of sunrise, reflections in water, or the glow of fire created sensations that shaped how they interpreted the invisible world. These early associations laid the groundwork for the first spontaneous beliefs born not from structure, but from instinct. Their interpretations were not random. They were the product of a mind trying to understand forces greater than its own awareness. Each object, each sound, each flicker of light became a small window into a mysterious world they sensed but could not explain, gently guiding them toward a shared understanding that reality extended far beyond what they could touch. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Which natural object or sound in your own life has ever felt strangely meaningful, even if just for a moment? Share it in the comments so we can expand this reflection together. The growing belief in meaningful objects, sounds, and lights subtly opened the door for something even more powerful within the primitive human mind. Individual experiences that could not be explained, yet felt undeniably real. These moments were deeply personal, often occurring in isolation, and they carried an intensity that changed how early humans perceived not only the world, but themselves. A sudden chill running across the skin without wind, the unmistakable feeling that someone was near when no one was present, or the strange sense that a thought had emerged from outside rather than within could alter their understanding of the invisible in profound ways. Imagine a lone wanderer returning from scouting, shaken not by a predator, but by an overwhelming sensation that the forest had been aware of their presence. Or a mother waking in the middle of the night, sensing danger before hearing even the faintest sound. These impressions were not logical, yet they were powerful enough to influence behavior. In a world without explanations, these experiences became markers of an unseen reality. They hinted that something out there was interacting with them on a personal level. Some of these moments were triggered by coincidence, like stumbling upon a rare fruit during hunger or witnessing an animal behave in an uncanny way. Others arose during emotional extremes. A moment of despair could suddenly be interrupted by a feeling of protection. A moment of exhaustion could be met with an inexplicable surge of calm. These events shaped early interpretations of presence, guidance, and meaning. Over time, they became internal signs, quiet confirmations that the invisible forces they felt were not distant or indifferent, but engaged with them. Trauma also played a crucial role. Encounters with death, near misses with predators, or the loss of a companion created psychological imprints that opened mental space for deeper reflection. When someone survived an attack they should not have, or when a dangerous moment was unexpectedly resolved, the experience carved itself into memory. It suggested intervention, even if they had no concept of intervention itself. These moments became stories told through gestures, sounds, and expressions, slowly spreading through the group as shared impressions of forces that acted beyond understanding. What made these experiences so transformative was not the event itself, but the emotional weight attached to it. The primitive human brain, evolving in complexity, began linking these sensations to the broader patterns it had been noticing. The invisible no longer felt like a distant presence shaping nature. It felt personal, involved, almost responsive. Each individual experience added a new layer to the growing sense that reality was more than what eyes could see, and that the unseen world had intentions that touched their lives directly, shaping their perceptions in ways they could not ignore. As those deeply personal and inexplicable experiences accumulated in the minds of early humans, something equally transformative began unfolding within their social groups. Individual impressions of the invisible were powerful, but when shared, even through the most primitive gestures and sounds, they gained a new dimension. A single person sensing a strange presence might question their own instincts, but when two or three reacted in similar ways across different moments, and unspoken, truth began to circulate among them. Spirituality, which had started within individual minds, slowly became a collective perception. Gathered around firelight, early humans exchanged more than warmth. They exchanged memory. A raised eyebrow, a sudden pause, a trembling hand pointing toward the darkness all carried meaning. Without structured language, communication happened through emotion. When one individual mimicked the feeling of being watched or showed the shiver that ran through their body, during an unexplained moment, others listened with a seriousness shaped by survival. These shared perceptions created an emotional network through which early spiritual ideas could travel. Over time, the group began to treat certain expressions or reactions as signs. A specific gesture might represent danger sensed but not seen. A soft vocalization might indicate gratitude for a narrow escape. Repetition gave these expressions structure, turning them into early forms of symbolic storytelling. What began as isolated experiences slowly wove into a fabric of shared understanding, reinforcing the belief that unseen forces shaped their existence. This emerging collective interpretation strengthened social bonds. Humans were no longer facing the unknown alone. When a member of the group communicated an experience with the invisible, others felt connected through their own memories of similar sensations. This connection provided emotional stability, making the mysterious feel less chaotic. The invisible became something they confronted together, something woven into their group identity. Transmission of these impressions was not limited to adults. Children, observing the reactions of elders, absorbed these silent narratives as natural truths. A slight movement of the hand toward a certain rock formation or a cautionary sound at the approach of a shadow created patterns of behavior that shaped the next generation. Through observation, imitation, and emotional resonance, early spirituality passed from one mind to another. As these shared interpretations continued to circulate, they began forming a collective inner landscape. The invisible world was no longer a private mystery. It had become part of their shared reality, influencing decisions, shaping behaviors, and deepening the connection between individuals. What had once been a solitary sensation was now a living presence held within the group, quietly guiding their perception of the world and preparing them for even more symbolic and intentional forms of spiritual expression. As the shared inner landscape of early humans expanded, their collective perception of the invisible began to take physical shape through instinctive movements and spontaneous behaviors. These gestures were not planned, nor were they taught. They emerged naturally, growing out of the emotional weight carried by the group. A simple act like placing a stone beside a fallen companion or drawing lines in the soil without knowing why became charged with meaning. These were the first expressions of ritual, born not from structure, but from the deep need to interact with forces they could not see yet felt profoundly. When someone in the group had a powerful encounter with the unknown, others often mirrored their reactions. A bowed head, a quiet sway, or a rhythmic tapping of fingers against a tree trunk carried an unspoken intensity. These repetitive gestures soothed fear, reinforced unity, and transformed emotion into action. Over time, patterns formed. Movements once instinctive began repeating, not because they were understood, but because they felt necessary. The earliest rituals emerged from this space between intuition and shared belief. Objects involved in previous experiences started gaining new layers of meaning through these actions. A certain stone might be placed in the same spot repeatedly after moments of danger. A piece of bone with an unusual shape might be carried by different members of the group, passed from hand to hand as if transmitting something unseen. Even the act of arranging sticks around a sleeping area could take on symbolic relevance. Each gesture strengthened the idea that these objects and actions bridged the visible and the invisible. Sounds, too, became part of these early rituals. A soft hum created during moments of tension, a rhythmic beat struck with stones, or a repeated vocalization during night gatherings helped synchronize the emotions of the group. These sounds created an invisible thread that linked individuals to one another, anchoring the sense that something beyond the physical world was guiding them. Light from fire flickering across their movements added a visual layer that intensified the experience, transforming ordinary actions into something ceremonial without conscious intention. These spontaneous rituals shaped how early humans interacted with their environment. They approached certain spaces with caution or reverence, as if the ground itself held memory. They repeated movements, not because they expected an outcome, but because the actions felt aligned with an unseen order. Through repetition, they began carving meaning into the world. These gestures were the seeds of symbolism, the first attempts of the human mind to speak to what it could feel but not define. As these expressions grew stronger, they opened the path for even more complex forms of spiritual interaction, shaping how future generations would understand the invisible forces surrounding them. Before we continue, share something with me. What instinctive gesture or small ritual from your own life has always felt strangely meaningful, even without explanation? Leave your comment so we can explore how these echoes of ancient behavior still live within us. As the earliest spontaneous rituals and gestures took shape within the group, something even more profound began stirring inside the primitive human mind. The symbols they created unconsciously were not only expressions of emotion, they became gateways to new forms of thought. When a gesture was repeated or an object was treated as meaningful, the mind began to associate layers of meaning that went far beyond the immediate physical experience. This was the quiet birth of symbolic cognition, a shift that would transform how early humans interpreted reality itself. Patterns of behavior that once comforted or unified the group now began to suggest deeper possibilities. If an object could represent a presence, perhaps that presence existed in a space separate from the visible world. If a gesture could influence emotion, perhaps it also influenced forces beyond human perception. These subtle leaps of intuition were not deliberate. They emerged from the brain's growing capacity to connect the concrete with the abstract, weaving ideas into places where no direct evidence existed. Through these connections, the concept of multiple layers of reality began to form. Some of these impressions came from moments that felt intensely dissonant, a dream that seemed too vivid, too real, or a sensory experience that felt disconnected from the physical moment could convince an early human that consciousness traveled beyond the body. The boundary between waking and dreaming began to blur. A dream in which a lost companion appeared might feel like a genuine encounter. A nightmare of danger could be interpreted as a message from something unseen. These experiences encouraged the belief that reality continued in dimensions they could enter and leave without control. Nature reinforced this growing perception. The changing colors of the sky, the shifting shadows at dusk, and the sudden stillness before storms created atmospheres that felt like portals into other layers of existence. Early humans did not think of these layers in terms of definitions or boundaries. They felt them emotionally, as if certain moments pulled them into a deeper version of the world. This emotional depth created the sense that reality was not flat or singular, but stacked, with each layer holding its own presence and meaning. Even the way they moved through familiar landscapes shifted. A cave entrance might feel like a threshold to a different realm. A large tree with unusual branches might appear as a meeting point between the visible and the unseen. Running water could feel like a boundary between two states of being. These intuitive interpretations strengthened the idea that the world around them was divided into layers, each influenced by forces they could sense but not fully grasp. Symbolic cognition allowed early humans to blend their internal experiences with external observations, creating a multi-dimensional understanding of existence. These layered perceptions would quietly guide them toward ever more complex interpretations of life, shaping their beliefs long before words or structured myths existed, expanding their sense of what it meant to inhabit a world filled with invisible depth. As early humans deepened their sense of layered reality, one experience stood above all others in shaping the way they interpreted the invisible: death. Nothing confronted them with such intensity, nothing stirred their inner world so completely. When a companion who once breathed, moved, and reacted suddenly became still, the change felt too abrupt, too absolute, to belong only to the physical world. This stillness carried weight. It demanded explanation, even though their minds did not yet possess the tools to form one. The lifeless body before them looked familiar, yet something essential had vanished. Early humans could perceive the difference long before they understood it. They recognized the absence as much as the presence that once existed. A body without movement was not just silent, it felt emptied. as if a force had departed. This deeply emotional contradiction between the physical form and the missing vitality shaped the earliest impressions of a separate realm. If something had left the body, then it must have gone somewhere. These moments were filled with confusion, fear, and profound curiosity. The group often gathered around the fallen individual, sensing that the moment carried significance. Some reached out to touch the cooling skin. Others stepped back, unsure whether the invisible force that had taken the life might still be near. Their reactions were guided by instinct, yet these instincts began weaving the idea that death opened a pathway into another layer of existence. Observing decomposition added another dimension to their interpretations. The body changed slowly over time, further confirming that whatever had animated it was gone, no longer part of the visible world. The transformation reinforced the belief that life was more than flesh. Something intangible had once lived within the body, and now it had returned to the invisible realm. This realization became a cornerstone of early spiritual thinking, shaping how they understood themselves and the world. Death also created behavioral shifts within the group. They became quieter, more cautious, more attuned to signals from the environment, as if the boundary between layers of reality had thinned. They often avoided the exact spot where someone had died, sensing that the place held lingering presence or memory. Sometimes they left objects with the body, not as offerings but as instinctive acts carrying symbolic weight. These behaviors marked the earliest attempts to interact with the unseen forces connected to death. The emotional impact was profound. Loss ignited longing, confusion, and a deep awareness of vulnerability. These feelings pushed the primitive mind to imagine what existed beyond physical life. They sensed continuity rather than finality, believing that the force once inside the body now traveled through a different layer of reality. In this quiet, instinctive interpretation of death, the seeds of afterlife, beliefs began to form, expanding their understanding of the invisible world and shaping the spiritual frameworks that would continue evolving for countless generations. As the presence of death carved its silent imprint into early human consciousness, something began to weave itself through the threads of their developing inner world. The invisible no longer felt like a distant force acting randomly upon their lives. It felt structured. It felt organized. Every instinctive gesture, every shared reaction, every symbolic interpretation of objects and spaces slowly converged into systems of understanding that shaped how groups moved, gathered, and made sense of existence. What began as isolated sparks of perception was now merging into the first fragile frameworks of spirituality that resembled the earliest forms of religion. These frameworks did not appear suddenly. They emerged from repetition, observation, and emotional need. When the group reacted to death with similar gestures, these gestures became associated with meaning. When certain objects were consistently treated with reverence, these objects became part of a shared symbolic vocabulary. As early humans attempted to influence the invisible through movement, sound, or placement of objects, these actions began forming the foundation of ritual behavior that was no longer purely instinctive. They became deliberate, even if their purpose remained undefined. Gatherings around firelight amplified these shared interpretations. The fire itself became a powerful symbol. Its warmth, its motion, and its ability to transform materials captured the imagination of early humans. Fire gatherings encouraged communication, even without structured language. Repeated stories expressed through gesture, repetition, and emotional cues created the first narrative threads connecting the visible world to the unseen. Over time, these shared narratives hinted at intentions behind natural forces, suggesting that the invisible realm operated with purpose rather than randomness. Leadership also began to play a role. Individuals who reacted more intensely to the invisible, or who experienced vivid dreams, or who displayed heightened sensitivity to environmental cues, became central figures within the group. Their interpretations carried weight, guiding collective behavior. These early leaders were not yet shamans or priests, but their influence laid the groundwork for roles that would eventually shape spiritual authority. Their presence helped transform scattered impressions into cohesive systems, allowing early spirituality to function as a guiding force that shaped group identity. This evolving structure provided comfort, direction, and a sense of continuity. It created a bridge between life and death, between fear and understanding, between the visible and the hidden. Through this gradual organization of symbols and shared beliefs, the earliest proto-religions emerged. They were fragile, undefined, and deeply emotional. Yet they represented the first attempts to articulate the relationship between humans and the invisible forces they sensed all around them. These early frameworks would one day evolve into the complex systems of belief known across the world. But their roots lived here, in these ancient minds, seeking meaning within darkness and wonder. And before we end this journey, let me invite you to be part of this exploration in your own way. If you reach this point, leave a comment saying something like, "I walked with them until the end, so I know you were here for the full experience." If this reflection added something valuable to your day, feel free to like the video and check if you are subscribed, because this kind of content only grows when more people walk with us. And if you want to continue expanding your understanding of the ancient human mind, there is another video here on the side that connects directly with what we explored. Take a look and keep traveling through these layers of our shared past with me.